Hey, everybody. Today we're going to be jumping around in several places in Scripture, but our primary Scripture is going to be 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 22. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 22. Paul says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." Here, Paul is saying that he is free from all. Jesus is his only Lord, but he chooses to make himself a servant to other people for the express purpose of leading them to Jesus. We continue in verse 20. "To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I may win those under the law." Now, Paul is Jewish. So what is he saying here? What he's saying here is that not that he shouldn't obey the commandments of the Lord, but he's referencing old Jewish laws that no longer apply to Christians, things that Paul has preached against in other parts of the New Testament, like circumcision, not eating certain meats. He says, look, we don't have to follow those rules anymore. You don't have to be circumcised to be saved. You don't have to avoid unclean meats in order to be saved. But if I come across someone who believes that way and I want to lead them to Christ, then I'll follow those rules if it just gives me the opportunity to share Jesus with them. He continues in verse 21. "To those outside of the law, I became as one outside of the law, not being outside the law myself, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those under the law." Again, Paul is not saying that he will act immorally in order to lead people to Christ. But what he is saying is that when he's around Gentiles who don't observe Jewish law, he's not going to get hung up on laws that they never swore allegiance to. He's going to try to meet them where they're at. He's going to do whatever it takes, as long as it doesn't go against Christ, in order to reach them. He finally says, "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." The general idea here is that Paul will use anything as long as it isn't sinful to win the lost. He sees himself as belonging to others. He chooses to belong to others for the purpose of bringing them to Jesus. And we see a few examples of this throughout Scripture, of people acting in this way. In Acts chapter 8, the Lord leads a man named Philip to a certain road as an Ethiopian court official comes by. And the Ethiopian is studying the prophecy of Isaiah. And Philip goes over to him and says, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the Ethiopian invites Philip to explain it to him. And look at Acts chapter 8, verse 35. "Then Philip opened his mouth and began with this scripture," the scripture he was studying in Isaiah, "and he told him the good news about Jesus." This is excellent. We meet people where they are at. We start with them wherever they're at, whether they're under the law or not under the law, whether they're Jewish or Gentile or weak or strong or whatever. And we tell them, we start where they're at, and we get them to the good news of Jesus. It is our task as Christians to use everything to tell people about Jesus. This is not manipulation. It's not being dishonest, because Jesus is connected to everything. In the next verse, the Ethiopian is baptized. In Acts chapter 16, Paul wants to take Timothy with him to minister the gospel. But Timothy is a Gentile. He's never been circumcised. So Paul encourages Timothy to get circumcised, which is almost funny, because Paul spends a huge amount of time, particularly in Galatians, preaching against the need to be circumcised. He's talking to people who believe you have to be circumcised to be saved. And he goes, "Guys, you don't need to do this. You don't understand the gospel if you think you need to be circumcised to be saved." But here he encourages Timothy to get circumcised. Timothy does get circumcised, not because he needs to, not because it'll save him, but because he's going to be ministering to Jewish people. And it'll remove an unnecessary barrier between those Jewish people and the gospel. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens, where they have many idols. It's a pagan society. And instead of being offended by their society, instead of being offended by all their idols, he actually uses one of their altars to the unknown God to preach the gospel to them. In fact, in his sermon, he quotes secular philosophers in order to make his point. Why am I saying all this to you? Because we Christians need to use everything to spread the gospel, even this crisis we're in right now, especially this crisis. Right now, people are scared. Everything, their wealth, their health, their government, and more are at risk. The things that have been their foundations are being called into question. They're looking for something real and stable and reliable to build their foundations on. And you and I know that there's only one who can be that for them. So be all things to all people. Listen, don't get offended by non-Christians acting like non-Christians. Find ways to meet them where they're at and talk to them about Jesus. In this time, I want to encourage you to think of at least one unchurched friend, coworker, neighbor, friend, family member, and reach out to them. You don't have to preach the gospel. Just let them know you're thinking of them, that you care, and see where it takes you. May you and I cause people to look to Jesus through this time of uncertainty. We'll see you tomorrow.